The story of Danny Roman begins in the sun-bleached streets of South Los Angeles during the 1970s and 1980s, a time when entire neighborhoods were carved into invisible borders by street gangs. Each block was claimed by someone, every corner watched by eyes that saw the world through loyalty and survival. Among the dozens of small gangs that fought for control, the Harpies stood out. Their home was the Figueroa Corridor, a strip of Los Angeles where poverty, drugs, and violence mixed into a single reality. It was here that a young man named Danny Roman, later known to the world as Popeye, began his climb from the rough backstreets of L.A. to the top of one of America's most feared prison organizations. Roman was not the loudest or the most flamboyant among his peers, but even in his youth, he carried an aura that set him apart. He was calculating, reserved, and disciplined, qualities rare in a world driven by impulse. Within the Harpies gang, he quickly developed a reputation for both intelligence and ferocity. He understood that power wasn't just about who could pull the trigger faster. It was about organization, communication, and fear. Under his quiet guidance, the Harpies became known for their precision and loyalty. While rival gangs like 18th Street and Playboys waged reckless wars, Roman's crew moved with a sense of order, guided by his almost military-like thinking. As the 1980s progressed, Los Angeles was in chaos. The crack cocaine epidemic had turned neighborhoods into battlefields. Drive-by shootings became routine, and the prison population exploded as law enforcement cracked down. It was during this wave of violence that Danny Roman's life took a permanent turn. In 1985, after a violent confrontation that left a man dead, Roman was convicted of first-degree murder. The court sentenced him to life without the possibility of parole. At just over 20 years old, his fate seemed sealed. He would spend the rest of his days behind bars, forgotten by the world outside. But Roman was not the kind of man who accepted finality. When he entered the California Department of Corrections, he entered another battlefield, one with its own laws, its own currency, and its own rulers. Inside, the Mexican Mafia, known simply as La M, reigned supreme. They were not just inmates, they were kings behind bars, controlling entire networks of street gangs from within their cells. For a man like Roman, whose mind was wired for structure and power, the world of La M was not a prison, it was an opportunity. Roman's adjustment to prison life was swift and deliberate. He studied how the system worked, who ran the kitchens, who controlled the phones, who traded in contraband. He observed the hierarchy of influence, how respect was earned, how messages were sent, and how orders could be given without a word. Other inmates noticed his discipline and his calm demeanor. He didn't brag, didn't boast, but his intelligence was impossible to miss. The older members of the Mexican Mafia saw potential in him. He had the right temperament, intelligent, patient, and utterly loyal to those he chose to serve. By 1988, just 3 years into his sentence, Danny Roman was inducted into the Mexican Mafia. It was both a baptism and a coronation. The initiation meant that he had proven himself worthy, not just through violence, but through understanding the code of La M. He had learned that control didn't come from chaos. It came from order, from the ability to make men act without question. Once inside, Roman wasted no time in aligning himself with the organization's larger vision. He knew that the Mexican Mafia's power came not from their numbers, but from their ability to command the streets from within the prison walls. As the 1990s approached, Roman began to extend his influence far beyond the yard. From inside his cell, he started to rebuild the structure of the Harpies gang, linking it directly to the operations of the Mexican Mafia. Letters, coded messages, and trusted intermediaries became his tools. He created a communication network that allowed him to issue orders, enforce discipline, and oversee criminal operations as if he were a free man. Drugs, extortion, and taxes flowed upward through the chain, feeding La.M.'s coffers. Roman's name started to carry weight, not just within prison, but on the streets of Los Angeles. In a world ruled by fear, Danny Roman was feared differently. He didn't need to shout or threaten. His commands were calm, his punishments precise. To those under him, he was a figure of authority who seemed untouchable, a man who turned a life sentence into a throne. Through sheer intellect and control, he began building something few inmates had ever managed, an organized system that functioned seamlessly between the prison yard and the city streets. For most inmates, a life sentence means the end of ambition. For Danny Roman, it was the beginning of empire. By the mid-1990s, he had transformed from a forgotten murderer into one of the Mexican Mafia's rising stars, a man whose reach extended from cell blocks to barrios, whose influence shaped the criminal ecosystem of Southern California. And while he could not have known it yet, the empire he was quietly constructing would one day bear his name, the Roman Empire. By the late 1990s, Danny Roman had become one of the most powerful and methodical figures within the Mexican Mafia. What separated him from most men who joined La.M. was that Roman was never satisfied with raw intimidation alone. He believed in control through structure, loyalty, and profit. From a cell deep within the California prison system, he transformed himself into a silent architect of power, orchestrating a criminal network that stretched across Los Angeles. To his subordinates, he wasn't just Popeye. He was the unseen general, the man who could command both the prison yard and the city streets with equal authority. Roman understood that the Mexican Mafia's strength lay in its ability to command street gangs from within prison walls. Under his direction, more than a dozen street gangs across South Los Angeles began paying taxes, or rent, a euphemism for tribute, in exchange for the right to operate. These payments were made in cash or drugs, and refusal meant death. Roman's organization demanded loyalty and respect, and in return, he provided structure and protection. He turned what was once a chaotic collection of independent gangs into an organized network that functioned like a business empire. From drug trafficking and murder contracts to extortion and street-level taxes, every transaction was a link in the chain that led back to him. The brilliance of Roman's leadership came from his ability to maintain communication. Prison walls could stop men, but they could not stop messages. Through coded letters, discreet phone calls, and tightly controlled visitation meetings, he managed to keep a constant flow of information between himself and the outside world. His most trusted intermediary was his daughter, Viana Roman, a young woman who had grown up witnessing her father's dual existence as both inmate and kingpin. During prison visits, Danny would speak to her in a mix of casual conversation and hidden meaning, using family talk to disguise orders. She would then carry those messages back to Los Angeles, where lieutenants and enforcers waited for her word. Viana's role in her father's network was both crucial and tragic. She was the bridge between two worlds, one of blood ties and one of criminal command. Federal investigators later discovered that she was passing detailed instructions from her father to his lieutenants, who should be taxed, which gangs should be punished, and how money was to be collected and distributed. It was an extraordinary system of command, built on trust and secrecy, and it allowed Roman to maintain dominance from hundreds of miles away. To the Mexican Mafia, he was proof that confinement did not mean weakness. To law enforcement, he was a ghost, impossible to stop, impossible to reach. Among Roman's many operations, one stood out for its audacity and scale: the Alameda Swap Meet in Los Angeles. This massive open-air marketplace, bustling with vendors and families, became one of his most profitable rackets. Roman soldiers extorted the vendors, forcing them to pay so-called union dues under threat of violence. Every stall, every sale, was another dollar in Laim's pocket. The racket was so sophisticated that some vendors didn't even realize they were funding a prison gang. They simply believed they were paying for security. For Roman, the swap meet symbolized the reach of his power. He didn't need to see his victims or touch the money himself. He merely issued the command, and it happened. But Roman's vision extended beyond greed. He wanted order among the Serrano gangs, the vast network of Latino street gangs across Southern California who owed allegiance to the Mexican Mafia. He imposed strict codes of conduct: no drive-by shootings without authorization, no inter-gang wars that could attract law enforcement, and no theft from community businesses under Laim's protection. Through these rules, Roman brought a level of discipline rarely seen in street gang culture. His influence created a fragile peace among many warring groups, united under the shadow of his control. In his mind, he wasn't merely a criminal. He was a ruler managing territories and subjects. However, power on that scale cannot remain hidden forever. In the mid-2000s, law enforcement agencies began to notice the consistency in how certain gangs operated and how their profits flowed. Investigators from the FBI, DEA, and LAPD collaborated to unravel what they described as an invisible empire. Their suspicions eventually culminated in a massive federal probe known as Operation Roman Empire, a name that reflected both the target and the magnitude of his influence. The investigation exposed the breadth of Danny Roman's criminal command. Wiretaps captured conversations between gang members discussing messages from Popeye. Surveillance teams document meetings where orders from prison were relayed through intermediaries. Agents intercepted coded letters and analyzed phone records linking Viana and other associates directly to imprisoned IME members. The evidence painted a vivid picture. Roman was orchestrating drug deals, extortion, and murder from a life without parole cell, commanding an army of loyalists who executed his will without hesitation. In 2012, federal prosecutors unsealed an indictment charging 29 individuals connected to Roman's network. The charges included racketeering, conspiracy, and drug trafficking. The operation's name, Roman Empire, was more than symbolic. It was an acknowledgement that this single inmate had built an empire of influence larger than any one neighborhood or gang. Yet despite being the investigation's central figure, Danny Roman himself was never charged. Already serving a life sentence, he remained untouched by federal prosecution, his empire crumbling around him while he sat behind bars. For law enforcement, the indictment was a victory. But for the Mexican Mafia, it was another reminder of how dangerous power could be when concentrated in the hands of one man. Many within Laime began to question Roman's leadership. Some accused him of drawing too much attention to himself, of relying too heavily on his daughter, and of putting the organization at risk. In the world of prison politics, even a whisper of weakness or exposure could lead to betrayal. Viana Roman's arrest and subsequent 15-year federal sentence in the wake of Operation Roman Empire dealt a heavy blow to her father. She had been his voice, his messenger, his link to the outside world. Without her, his communication network weakened, and his control began to falter. For the first time in decades, Danny Roman's empire showed cracks. Yet despite these setbacks, his name still carried weight. He was still respected, still feared, and still consulted by other high-ranking EME members. Even confined within his cell, his words continued to ripple through the underworld of Los Angeles. But time was not on his side. The Mexican Mafia was changing. A new generation of members, younger, more aggressive, and less disciplined, was emerging. They didn't care for the quiet control that Roman practiced. They wanted violence, visibility, and immediate profit. The old guard, men like Roman, who believed in stability and structure, were increasingly seen as relics of another era. Within the organization's upper ranks, murmurs of discontent began to grow. Some felt that Roman had outlived his usefulness. Others saw an opportunity to climb the hierarchy by taking down one of its most respected elders. Inside prison, reputation is everything, but it is also fragile. Danny Roman had built his empire on fear and respect, but both are fleeting currencies. As the 2010s unfolded, alliances shifted, loyalty thinned, and the shadow of betrayal crept closer. The man who had once united Los Angeles gangs under one banner now found himself surrounded by younger EME members who viewed him not as a mentor, but as an obstacle to their ambitions. Danny Roman had spent decades mastering the art of control, but in the ruthless world of the Mexican Mafia, control never lasts forever. The empire he had built through patience and precision was now being challenged by the very forces he had once commanded. The seeds of his downfall had already been planted, and they were growing within his own ranks. By the late 2000s, Danny Roman had spent over 3 decades inside the California prison system. To many, he was an elder statesman of the Mexican Mafia, a figure who commanded quiet respect, a man whose influence had once shaped the criminal landscape of Los Angeles. But prison empires are built on shifting sand. Power in La-Im was never permanent, and loyalty was always conditional. The same system that had elevated Roman to near-mythic status was now beginning to close in on him. Inside Corcoran State Prison, one of California's most volatile and tightly controlled facilities, Roman remained a formidable presence. His reputation alone carried weight. Younger inmates often lowered their heads when he walked past, aware that a man like him could still decide their fate. But the Mexican Mafia was changing. The new generation of members was more impulsive, less disciplined, and far less loyal to the codes that once governed La-M. They saw Roman and others of his era as remnants of an old order, men who clung to hierarchy in a world that now thrived on chaos and profit. Roman's power had always rested on his ability to communicate and to command from within confinement. But as the years went by, communication became more difficult. The California Department of Corrections had grown more sophisticated, tightening restrictions, monitoring mail, and limiting interactions between high-ranking gang members. The once flourishing network of messages that had allowed Roman to run his empire was now under constant threat. To the younger EME members, this was a sign of weakness. They whispered that Roman's era was over, that his time as a leader had expired. Tension began to build behind the walls. Some of Roman's old allies had either died, retired, or been transferred. Others turned against him, aligning themselves with the younger faction that wanted to take control. Among them were inmates like Raul Alvarado and Edward Cisneros, both longtime soldiers of the Mexican Mafia who had earned reputations for violence and loyalty to the organization. But within La-M, loyalty often shifts with the wind. It was only a matter of time before their devotion to Roman's legacy would turn into obedience to someone else's orders. Roman had survived decades in one of the most dangerous environments imaginable by relying on calculation and restraint. He avoided unnecessary conflict, focused on order, and often served as a mediator when disputes arose between Sereno factions. But that approach, the same discipline that had once made him a leader, now made him a target. In the eyes of the new blood, Roman was too cautious, too structured, too unwilling to bend to their impulsive demands. Worse, he was still respected by many, and in the world of prison politics, respect is power, and power breeds paranoia. By 2020, Danny Roman was 64 years old. He had spent more than half his life behind bars, and though age had slowed his body, his mind remained sharp. He was still considered a shot caller, still involved in prison affairs, though less actively than before. Those close to him noticed he carried himself differently, quieter, more introspective, as if aware that the life he had built was nearing its end. He had seen countless men rise and fall within the ranks of La Im. He understood better than anyone that power inside the Mexican Mafia is temporary. It's borrowed, not owned. On the morning of June 10th, 2020, the yard at Corcoran State Prison buzzed with the usual sounds of routine. Inmates talking, walking laps, lifting weights. It was an ordinary day, and Roman was in the yard among his peers, relaxed but vigilant. He had survived too long to ever let his guard fully down. But on that day, the danger came from within, from men who shared the same tattooed symbol, the same oath of silence. Without warning, Raul Alvarado and Edward Cisneros approached him. What happened next took only seconds. Shanks flashed in the sunlight. Roman was attacked swiftly and brutally, stabbed multiple times in the chest and neck. Witnesses later said he didn't scream or try to run. He simply fell, his body collapsing to the ground as officers rushed in. By the time medical personnel reached him, Danny Roman was dead. News of his death spread quickly through the California prison system. For the Mexican Mafia, it was both shocking and symbolic. Roman had been a part of La M since the 1980s, a living connection to the organization's old guard, a bridge between the past and present. His murder wasn't just another prison killing, it was a message. It signaled the end of an era where men like Roman ruled with structure and restraint. The empire he had built, the networks, the order, the taxes, the codes, had outlived him, but not in the way he intended. It had mutated into something more chaotic, more violent, and far less loyal. Investigators concluded that Roman's killing was an intra-organizational hit, a sanctioned assassination ordered from within the Mexican Mafia itself. Though no official motive was ever confirmed, the pattern was clear. It was political. Power struggles had long plagued La M, and Roman's leadership, even diminished by age, posed a threat to those seeking dominance. His death removed an obstacle for the newer generation, eager to reshape the organization in their image. In the unforgiving calculus of the Mexican Mafia, one man's fall always meant another man's rise. For many who knew him, Roman's death carried a grim irony. He had spent a lifetime building order out of chaos, believing that discipline could civilize even the most violent of men. Yet, in the end, it was that same world of violence that consumed him. He was killed not by rivals or enemies from the streets, but by the very brotherhood he had served and strengthened. His empire had turned inward, devouring its architects. Outside the prison walls, the echoes of his power still lingered. The street gangs that once paid tribute to him continued to operate, though without the same cohesion he enforced. The Alameda swap meet extortion ring, once his most profitable venture, had been dismantled by law enforcement freeing vendors who had lived for years under the threat of his network. His daughter, Viana Roman, was still serving her federal sentence, a prisoner of the empire her father created. The structure he had built, once so strong, now existed only in fragments, scattered leaders, fractured loyalties, and the memory of a man who had once ruled from the shadows. In death, Danny Roman became a legend of contradiction. To law enforcement, he was proof of how deeply organized crime could infiltrate every level of society. To fellow inmates, he was a symbol of what ultimate control inside prison could look like, and of how fleeting it truly was. Some remembered him as a man of discipline and intelligence, someone who brought order to chaos. Others saw him as a tyrant who taxed his own people and manipulated everyone around him for personal power. Both were true, and both defined the man known as Popeye. The Mexican Mafia survived his death, as it had survived every death before his. But it was not the same organization. The structure and rules that men like Roman had enforced were now replaced by a more fragmented, unpredictable form of leadership. The balance of fear that had once held the streets together was gone. In its place stood something more volatile, a reflection of what happens when an empire loses its emperor. Danny Roman's life and death reveal a paradox at the heart of the prison underworld. Even absolute power is temporary. No matter how strong, disciplined, or feared a leader becomes, time and ambition eventually consume them. Roman ruled through intellect and order in a world that thrived on chaos. And when that chaos finally came for him, it arrived silently, through the same code he had once enforced. A code that promises loyalty but delivers betrayal. Danny Popeye Roman died as he lived, surrounded by killers, bound by the rules of an empire that gave him everything and, in the end, took it all away. His story is more than the tale of one man's rise and fall. It's the story of the Mexican Mafia itself, how power is built, how it corrodes, and how in the brutal ecosystem of prison life, no empire, no matter how disciplined, can last forever.